Louis, thanks for joining us. I've been looking forward to talking to you. One reason is that I've been binging on your podcast, which is called Ideas Matter. And you and your mate Alex discussed some serious ideas. I think you really deep ideas in philosophy, in politics, in culture, but in bite size and in an accessible way. One podcast particularly intrigues me. I think it was done about a year ago, in which you compares Western liberalism
Mm.
with uh, Confucianism. And what I find intriguing is towards the end, you said, well, most of us are liberals in the philosophical sense of the word, not just liberal versus conservatives. But liberal in a sense, we think about ourselves as individuals and the government as having certain responsibility towards the citizens. But if you dig down, if you go deeper into the presuppositions of liberalism, we find a lot of odd ideas that may not be obvious. And on the other hand, you also find a lot of ideas in Confucianism quite make a lot of sense, quite amenable. And yet, most of us are liberals rather than Confucian. So I don't want to put words into your mouth, but maybe you can explain more about what you mean by that.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me. We started the podcast without thinking anyone would listen to it, so it's great to know that there are people listening to it. So that's a huge pleasure to hear. So thank you for that. Yeah. So the podcast that I think you're referring to was actually the subject of my master's thesis, which I wrote when I was a Schwarzman scholar at Tsinghua University. Um, and that was a comparison of Western liberalism and Confucianism. But more specifically, what I asked in that research project was, is there a Confucian theory of freedom? Because there's a lot of liberal chauvinism, let's call it, this idea that unless a state is liberal in some sense, then it's insufficient, it's inferior. And the reason, really, when you ask most liberals why they think liberal philosophy, liberal ideology is the end of history, to use a famous term, is because it places at its center human freedom. Human freedom really is, for liberalism, the end goal. And it's a particular type of freedom. It's a freedom to pursue your own good in your own way, to quote John Stuart Mill. And so I thought, well, if this is at the center of liberalism, and if this is what makes liberals so confident in the superiority of their theory, then I thought it would be interesting to look at Confucianism because of China's increasing role in the world, and indeed a sort of revival of, or a reappreciation of, Confucius in contemporary China. Can you find a Confucian theory of freedom, and might it be comparable or even superior to a liberal theory of freedom? And so that was really the impetus of that research project, and that was the podcast was about that project, really.
Is there a theory of freedom in Confucianism? Did you find one?
Yeah, I think so. Although it's perhaps very overly confident of a young man from Australia to assert that
Yeah.
that I've got my own unique reading of this old tradition. But I argued that you can find a theory of freedom in Confucianism, and I argued that in some ways it is more desirable than a liberal theory of freedom, because in liberalism, really what they're advocating for is what's known as negative liberty or negative freedom. It's simply an absence of external interference or control over an individual. And so, as long as an individual has no interference in how they plan and order their life, then they can be considered free. And I argued for various reasons, which we can go into if you'd like, that that theory of freedom was insufficient. And it often, I think the major error that it makes is it conflates freedom and choice. It assumes that if an individual has a large range of choices, they're free. But the main problem is that it doesn't really have enough attention or enough to say about how you actually create the conditions in which people can exercise their choice meaningfully. And I think that is the area in which Confucianism was superior, because it doesn't understand people first and foremost as isolated individuals. It sees them existing in a social context and having their identity constituted and defined by the social roles and relationships that they hold in society. And so you're not free if you're free from these roles. It sees freedom as something that is first and foremost contextual, and it places a focus on actually cultivating people, attaining virtue. And so to sum it up, I argued that in Confucianism, you're free if you cultivate virtue such that you can follow the way, the Tao, spontaneously. And once you become virtuous and you learn to desire what is good and what is virtuous spontaneously, because a lot of Western philosophy sees freedom in this very rational sense, in this sort of Platonic sense that you want to attain rational mastery over your desires. And so there's this constant struggle all the time between your reason and your desires, and you're always trying to subdue your desires. Whereas in Confucianism, you get hints at this notion that really you want to actually learn to desire what is good, and then you're free because you're not engaged in this constant struggle to submit your desires to reason. They become one and the same thing.
So are you a Confucian or liberal?
Well, I'm now studying a PhD, and I went into the PhD wanting to write, I won't say an anti-liberal, but continuing this research that I'd done in my master's project, but applying it to the global level, asking whether there are principles of justice that liberals and Confucians could both agree to. And my response to this question goes back to your first question about when I said, in some sense, we're all liberals. And my thesis supervisor said something very insightful that I haven't been able to shake off. And she said, well, you're framing this project as a critique of liberalism, but really one of your motivations actually presupposes a core idea of liberalism, and that is for a political order, be it domestic or international, to be legitimate, the people that exist under that order have to consent to that order. They have to agree to it. And that is a very liberal understanding. And so in one sense, that's reflective of your first question, that in some way we're all liberals. So I would say that liberalism is necessary in some senses in modern society, but I would say it's deeply insufficient. It doesn't have a rich understanding of, I think, what it is to be human. And I think Confucianism offers a good supplement to liberalism. Liberalism can be a bit empty. It doesn't have a fully fleshed theory of the good life, whereas Confucianism does. And I think Confucians and liberals, rather than viewing them as binary opposites, which is what I sort of did when I was a bit younger and naive, I think, today I would say, well, Confucians and liberals have a lot to say to one another. And I think in particular, liberals have a lot to learn from Confucianism.
Well, it's interesting. You earlier said people sometimes confuse freedom with choices.
Mhm.
Actually, that's I wonder if it's a confusion or deliberate equations especially in neoliberalism and neoliberal economics. You often
Yes.
hear from big corporation, Apple or something, or a detergent company, whatever. Is we have all these choices
Mm.
that you can pick. But it's all, or if you are in pensions, you work your whole life, you're in pensions, and you have 20 different pension scheme to choose from. Whereas most people would say, oh, one or two would be sufficient, or one or two is perfect. All these choices are just ways to whip you off, basically, for lack of a
Yes.
better word. But
Yeah.
modern contemporary consumerism and capitalism is really based on these choices because that's just what drive consumerism. You only order them one choice and that's the one that everybody likes and that is useful, then how are they going to make money? In a way
Yeah.
that an exploitation of the
Mm.
consumers who are also workers.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
and Confucianism, I think at least in that respect, doesn't have that exploitation. Maybe it has a political exploitation, but not so much an economic exploitation.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting observation. I focus more on the politics, so I'm not really sure how
Right.
one could apply Confucianism to economics, but that's a very interesting thought.
Because well, after watching your podcast, I was just looking at Margaret Thatcher, and then Margaret Thatcher
Ah,
said
yes.
some things. At the time, it made no sense to me, but now it does. There's no such thing as society. So
Mm.
what she didn't say is, well, it's all individuals. It's all individuals and their choices and the choices they make. And okay, there's another thing I found quite interesting because I study philosophy and I still read philosophy, and you said something quite interesting. You said Descartes' I
Mm.
think, therefore I am is at the origin of liberalism,
Yep.
or something to that effect, which most of us wouldn't make that association, and I did and still don't. But maybe you can defend and explain what you mean by that, because he was in bed, getting up late, and coming up with this uh, brain divorced from the body kind of thing,
Mm.
and how did that become the basis of a political idea called liberalism?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Um, the contemporary philosopher Slavoj Žižek once identified what he thought were the three most important philosophers in the Western tradition. The first one was Plato, the second one was Descartes, and the third was Hegel, if I'm not mistaken. And the reason he identified those three philosophers is because he said they all changed the way in which we do philosophy. And so, to answer your question, what's important about Descartes in a political sense is that his project of radical doubt, as we all know, he says, well, okay, I'm now uncertain about what I know, and I want to rebuild this certainty from the ground up. So I'm going to pretend that I know nothing. And he engages in this project of radical doubt. And he says, well, the one thing that I can't doubt, the one thing that I just have to be sure of is that I exist. Because if I don't exist, then who is doing the doubting? So I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum, the famous line from Descartes. Now, this idea, I think, is important politically because what Descartes is doing is he identifies himself, like the agent Descartes is not with his body, right? Not with any sort of external attachment, because he can't be certain. He's skeptical that any of those things actually exist. So at bottom, what Descartes and what we all really are is these sort of disembodied minds, which means that our identity is almost this immaterial substance that exists separate to our physical existence. And that means that any external attachment that I might have in this world, my body, my nationality, anything like that, my social relationships, my biology even, these are all accidental or incidental to my true identity, which is this disembodied mind that I have, my thinking self. Descartes says, what am I? I'm a thing that thinks, I'm a thing that doubts. It's this very rationalist conception of what it is to be a human. And I think you can actually find the implications of this idea in liberal philosophy because, as I said before, liberalism views freedom as this project of detaching oneself from external interference. Everything has to be freely chosen for it to be legitimate to a liberal. And we can include this, we expand it to sex and gender and nationality. All of these things, they might be important, but they're secondary to my identity and they're secondary to my moral concern. What really matters is the self within, the rational thinking self. That is who I am, and that is what matters politically and ethically. Everything else, one's nationality, etc., this is all secondary. And so I'm not the first person, obviously, to make this observation, to suggest that this core idea in liberalism, the thing that liberalism is freeing, right, but the subject that liberalism wants to free is this Cartesian rational self.
Are you saying we can hang all these liberal rights on this thinking subject? I mean, say I don't know, that the UN Declaration or the Universal Declaration of Rights. Can we
Mm-hmm.
hang all those rights on this thinking subject, disembodied or very abstract subject, or somehow
Yeah.
there is in it? Go ahead.
I think so.
Go
I mean,
ahead.
lots of people do make that argument, and I think that is fairly convincing. That the idea of rights, really, I mean, historically that is the case, but you don't want to make the genetic fallacy and assume that just because something came from somewhere, it must always and has to come from that, intellectual history. But that is a very compelling argument, I think, that the idea of human rights, as we find in contemporary society, at least rests in a philosophical sense on this Cartesian understanding.
I in I think another podcast you said, well, you're more in favor of Daoism than
Mm.
Confucianism. Uh, it is do you see a political implication in Taoism, or more a personal way of life that they prefer
Yeah, yeah. I think it's probably
as a
fairer to,
West?
as a Westerner, personally, I probably see Taoism as more useful to my day-to-day life, rather than a sort of political theory. And reading about Taoism, I became interested in Chinese philosophy and Chinese culture because as a teenager I practiced a lot of Chinese martial arts. And so when I began to learn about Taoism, a lot of things sort of made sense in retrospect about things that my Chinese instructor would often say about the philosophy behind the martial arts system. I go, oh, okay, now I understand what he was talking about when I learn about Taoism and sort of, uh, you know, not meeting force with force and going with the path of least resistance and following the harmony. That all made more sense to me retrospectively, and so I did slip numerous references to Chinese kung fu into my master's thesis.
Well, actually, I read somewhere because I didn't know this. Apparently, Kung Fu originally didn't mean martial arts. Didn't
That's
mean
correct. Yeah.
fighting,
Yeah.
but Kung Fu was rather a way of living and dealing with your life. And the reason I asked you about Taoism because my uncle is actually was actually a Taoist master in
Oh.
the biggest temple in Hong Kong. And that's the thing. And most of us Chinese, and many of us growing up in Hong Kong, associate Taoism with superstition, ghosts, uh,
Mm.
you know, incense burning and getting wishes. Mostly from a more superstitious angle than a more rational philosophical. I think there's a Western bias looking at Taoism as kind of more sophisticated self-help philosophy,
Yeah.
rather than a kind of superstitions
Mm.
that
Mm.
sometimes you outgrow when you're a Chinese growing up in the Chinese community. So some of us still
That's
believe in feng shui.
That's a fair observation. Reading Western philosophers from sort of 30, 40, 50 years ago who would work on Chinese philosophy often made the distinction, which I thought was quite odd, between philosophical Taoism and religious Taoism. And I think that's probably, as you're suggesting, a bit of a Western bias and a bit of a sort of arbitrary distinction, sort of looking at this tradition and trying to pull out of it things that you like. But really, it makes more sense if you view it in its whole. I mean, we wouldn't talk about philosophical Christianity and religious Christianity, right? It's just Christianity. So it's probably, as you say, a Western bias of how we read these things, and perhaps in a crude way view it as a system of self-help.
You spent a year as a research fellow in China, right? For your masters. What's your experience like? Is it very different pursuing humanities at in graduate school in China than say in Australia or
Um,
Western country?
hmm. It wasn't hugely different, although I would have to say that was probably because my experience was rather unique, in that I was a Schwarzman scholar. And so the academic program that we were learning was co-designed by Chinese and Western academics from American and British universities. So I wouldn't want to say that I fully experienced what it's like to be a graduate student at a Chinese university. So I think my experience was quite unique. But you know, I did this at the height of Australia and China tensions when the relationship really went south, and I heard a lot of people say, "Oh no, you can't study in China. You won't be allowed to say X, Y, and Z," and that didn't turn out to be the case. So there was a lot of hysteria going into it, which wasn't borne out by my experience.
Is it still the paranoia and the antagonism? Is it still there in Australia, or has it moderated somewhat?
It has moderated somewhat since the results of the last election, and we've actually just last week the Chinese premier was in Australia, the first visit I think in 7 years, and in November last year our prime minister went to China, went to Beijing.
Yeah.
So it's definitely moderated a lot, but the paranoia and the fear towards China is always just below the surface, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. Maybe I'll ask you one last question. So it's from your podcast. It was a discussion about ideology, and
Hmm.
I think the conclusion that you two reach is that you can't really get away from ideology. Most of us think ideology is like fashion, so you can put it on.
Yeah.
I can be a Marxist when I was young. The older you get, you become a liberal, and then you become a conservative in your old age when you retire. But you don't think that's not how ideology works. You think that it's basically inescapable. It's always there. Uh,
Yes.
um, so how can anyone escape it, or even be aware of it?
We could be aware of it, but I don't think we can ever escape it. I mean, there are different ways people use the word ideology, and probably in the sense that you've alluded to is ideology is a sort of systematic critique of society and then a plan about how to reconstitute it. So, socialism, Marxism, liberalism are ideologies in that sense. Uh, a lot of critical theorists, psychoanalysts, Marxists also use ideology in the sense of really it's just a mental schema. It's how we make sense of the world. It's the sort of concepts and biases that we have that we filter information through and we take it in. And in that sense, we can never be free from ideology. I mean, we can't read the news in a perfectly detached, objective, neutral sense. We're always filtering it through presuppositions that we have and ways in which we view the world that we're not aware of. And something that we've argued ad nauseum in the podcast is that in the Western world, one of the core ideological presuppositions that we can't escape is that people are individuals. And so a lot of the podcast was exploring that ideological presupposition. But no, you can never really escape ideology. You can try and become aware of it, and that's good. But everyone has mental schemas that they use to make sense of the world.
But how are these mental schemas different from philosophy or some philosophical systems?
They're not really. Uh, I think
Then why
philosophy would
call
just
it
be
ideology? It's like philosophy. It's like Confucianism. It
mm,
can be a state ideology that try to legitimize certain types of rulership, but it's also a
mm,
philosophy. But
mm.
the way you talk about it, they amount to the same thing.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you define ideology, and the term I think in that particular podcast that you're referring to may have been about Louis Althusser, but I think
And the
just
Matrix.
pardon.
Yes, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that was a long time ago. That was at the height of our lockdown.
Uh,
Yeah, I think if you just understand ideology as a system of ideas, then you're quite right that philosophy is probably just a more coherent attempt to organize your ideology and to understand it and to be aware of your presuppositions.
Maybe I'll ask you one thing that I'm really curious. That's after watch binging on your podcast. I'm going to make a bold prediction. You think the future
Okay.
belongs to you think the future belongs to the West or China? As a well, can I call you a political philosopher, or at least that's your specialty, a political philosopher?
Yeah, yeah, political philosopher, political theorist. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, as a political theorist or political philosopher, do you think the future belongs to China or the West, or neither?
I don't think it belongs to either. But I think it's obvious that Western hegemony is on the decline, and I guess my the core motivation that I have in my intellectual life and even my personal life with my interest in Chinese martial arts is that people in the West can stop viewing the rise of China through such a scared lens. And the future will belong to both civilizational traditions, and my hope is that we can learn from each other. There's a lot that Chinese philosophy has to say to Western philosophy, political, metaphysical, etc., and vice versa. And so I hope that we can get away from this binary logic or either or seeing these two countries, states, civilizations as necessarily destined for conflict.
So
That's
you
I guess
think
that's the core.
we are done with hegemony,
Done
or
with
in
hegemony.
the future there will not be hegemony. There will just be a multipolar world.
It was certainly, yes, absolutely multipolar world. I see no other plausible prediction than multipolarity.
Well, okay. Um, Thanks for talking to me. Um,
My pleasure.